Welcome to the Lend Me Your Ears podcast, where we explore practical, real-world solutions to everyday sales challenges. Today's episode draws from a compelling article on lendmeyourears.co.ke titled, Can Jimi Wanjigi Uberize Kenyan Politics? And trust me, if you've felt the tension in the country, the uncertainty, the fatigue, the hunger for change, this conversation is going to feel uncomfortably familiar.
And that question isn't as dramatic as it sounds, because disruption always looks impossible, until suddenly it isn't. Think about Uber. For decades, taxis ran on licenses, cartels, and unwritten rules. Then, quietly, almost innocently, an app born in a garage slipped through a crack nobody noticed. And boom, the whole industry had to rethink what a taxi even meant.
Or Airbnb. Hotels had their systems, their chains, their regulations. Then two guys decided people could sleep in a stranger's spare room. Ridiculous. Until it wasn't.
So when Wanjigi stands up and says, Kenya doesn't need a faster horse, it needs a car, the real question becomes, is he Uber or is he a fintech? A bold idea that shakes the table for a moment before the table absorbs it and carries on.
Because disruption has a certain seduction. It promises efficiency, innovation, progress. Uber changed how we move. Airbnb changed how we travel. And M-Pesa changed how the world thinks about money.
But disruption also has a dark mirror. For every Uber, there are 100 fintechs that declared banks dead. We'll build apps, we'll move fast, we'll replace the dinosaurs. 2 decades later, banks are still standing, stronger even, because they adapted, absorbed, partnered, regulated.
And that's the tension. Sometimes the disruptor overturns the system. Sometimes the system swallows the disruptor whole.
So when Wanjigi positions himself as the outsider, the maverick, the question becomes, is Kenya ready for that kind of disruption? Or will politics, with all its tribalism, money networks, and decades-old alliances, simply bend, absorb, and outlast him?
Here's the twist. Wanjigi isn't exactly an outsider. He's been an insider, just not the kind that stands at rallies. A broker, a mediator, a man in the shadows during Kenya's biggest political turning points.
So this isn't some overnight awakening. It's more like a public unveiling of a role he's always played quietly.
And Kenyans know this dance. We've tasted disruption before. Remember 2002? When Kibaki swept in with free primary education, massive freedoms, and a national optimism so intense that the world ranked Kenya the most hopeful country on earth.
We really felt like the script had changed. But disruption, if not protected, is reversible. Old habits returned: corruption, patronage, recycling. If Wanjigi aims to be Kenya's Uber moment, he has to solve what Kibaki couldn't. How do you make disruption stick?
Because at the heart of disruption is one simple thing: the ability to see opportunity where others only see tradition. Uber saw inefficiency. Airbnb saw unused space. Fintech saw friction.
And Wanjigi sees cracks in Kenya's economic structures, political culture, and colonial inheritance. He frames himself as the one willing to press into those cracks and force a new shape. But disruption isn't just about the disruptor. It's also about timing, technology, and public readiness.
Uber flourished because smartphones were everywhere and people were fed up with taxis. Airbnb grew because millennials wanted authenticity and cheaper travel. M-Pesa exploded because the banking system wasn't built for ordinary Kenyans.
So the real question becomes, are Kenyans prepared for a Wanjigi-shaped disruption? Or will the establishment recycle him into the same old machinery?
And this is where it gets really interesting. Because real, lasting disruption in Kenya won't come from rallies or press conferences. It will come from the youth.
They're the majority. 19.2 is the average age. 70% of Kenyans are under 35. 8.9 million registered voters skipped the 2022 polls. Another 5.7 million youth are eligible but not even registered.
And yet, this same Gen Z mobilized protests, exposed political hypocrisy with memes, reframed national debates, and even accepted invitations Skate House to receive goodies, and yet had threatened to occupy parliament. Tribeless, leaderless, fearless, and partyless. This still-to-be-understood generation is quite the paradox.
Because a movement that looks like a revolution can dissolve into apathy just as easily.
So, for Wanjigi, that's the double-edged sword. Tap into their frustrations, jobs, debt, education, dignity, and he rides a tsunami. Fail to connect, and he becomes another suit with recycled promises.
So what cards has he already put on the table? A businessman with resilience, raided by 2 regimes, arrested yet unshaken. A figure who has survived the very system he now says he wants to disrupt.
The innovator who introduced Kenyans to anticipatory bail. Bail granted in anticipation of arrest. A legal hack that revealed cracks in state power. To some, a masterstroke. To others, proof of a man willing to exploit the law for survival.
The anti-colonial critic challenging structures inherited from empire, arguing that Kenya is still trapped in neo-colonial dependency, still operating within frameworks designed for someone else's benefit.
The entrepreneur behind major infrastructure financing deals, private garbage collection under Moi, and a long track record of spotting inefficiencies and monetizing them. Then there's his policy edge, calling for elections to be brought forward to 2026 as per the Constitution, railing against unsustainable public debt, overtaxation, and defending the right of citizens to protest.
And then there's debt rejection. Wanjigi goes further than most, flatly rejecting the idea that Kenyans must service odious debt, money borrowed unconstitutionally by current and previous regimes. He frames it as a yoke to be cut off, invoking examples like Mozambique, arguing that citizens should not be enslaved by obligations incurred outside constitutional bounds. By his reckoning, the potential relief amounts to over 2 trillion shillings annually. Even 20% of that, he argues, could fund free education for every Kenyan from pre-unit to university, while guaranteeing universal healthcare accessible with nothing more than an ID card.
It's here that he casts his boldest vision, a financially independent Kenya, with close to 0% borrowing for Wanjiku, you and I, the ordinary Kenyan, by the government getting out of borrowing locally. A prosperous and dignified standard of living for every citizen. And a Kibaki-era economy on steroids, sustainable, dynamic, and driving rapid growth. An economic revolution.
For Wanjigi, the battlefield of politics should be the economy, not tribe. Yet he reminds Kenyans that regardless of who gets into power, the debt yoke will continue to choke them, unless someone is bold enough to cut it loose.
He's not just talking locally either. He's taken the message global, even hiring a US lobbying firm to amplify his vision abroad. And then there are the moments that reveal his appetite for confrontation. Immediately after his release in 2024, he stared into the camera and declared, "William Ruto, I'm coming for you." That is not the language of consensus. That is the language of a disruptor determined to take on the incumbent head-on.
But every disruptor faces the same basic dilemma. How do you break in without being crushed? Uber ignored taxi regulations until it had enough users to fight back. Airbnb sidestepped hotel laws until it became too big to ignore. Fintechs discovered that without licenses and partnerships, they couldn't topple banks.
Wanjigi faces his own version of that dilemma. Politics is not tech. It's messy, tribal, deeply personal. It is fueled by money, alliances, and decades-old networks. To disrupt it, you either bypass it completely, like M-Pesa did to banks, or you infiltrate it from within. An insider himself, Which path will he take? And even if he succeeds in shaking the table, will Kenyans embrace him, or will the system absorb him as it has so many others? Wanjigi is no rebel without a cause. His cause is clear. What's unclear is whether Kenyans believe it's theirs too.
And that brings us to Kenya's bigger appetite or hesitation around change. Kenya has a curious relationship with disruption. On one hand, it is the land of M-Pesa, the fintech that shook the global banking establishment and forced even regulators to adjust. On the other, it is the land where powerful cartels, entrenched systems, and traditional politics often swallow rebels whole. Handshakes, voter suppression, hijacked protests, even the courts thwarting his 2022 presidential bid all reveal a system well-versed in protecting itself.
Kenyans are restless, weary of corruption, frustrated by economic stagnation, skeptical of political recycling. Yet at the same time, they are cautious. Change in Kenya often excites in theory, but falters in practice.
So far, Wanjigi is the only contenders with a clear and actionable response to the question hanging over every Kenyan household. What next after Ruto? If he wants to be Kenya's Uber moment, he must present not just rhetoric, but a tangible, workable alternative. Disruption is not just about attacking the old system, it's about building something so useful, so irresistible that people can't imagine going back.
And yet, it's worth remembering, had Airbnb, M-Pesa, or Uber been pitched to you at inception, you likely would have shrugged and said, what people want is a faster horse, not this thing you're calling a car.
So, can Wanjigi Uberize Kenyan politics? Could he be the disruptor who forces the old guard to adapt? Or will he become another fintech, innovative, bold, but ultimately absorbed?
Because disruption isn't about the disruptor. It's about the people who decide the old way no longer works. And in Kenya today, those people are overwhelmingly young, restless, tribeless, digitally fluent, and done with business as usual.
The timing is perfect. The cracks are showing, the appetite is rising. But will Gen Z board his Safina party, or see him as just another old taxi wearing a fresh coat of paint?
That's the million shillings question. Thanks for joining us on the Lend Me Your Ears podcast. If you enjoyed this conversation, subscribe and stay tuned. More field-tested insights are coming your way.
Thank you for lending us your ears. Until next time, stay informed, stay curious, and as always, keep questioning the status quo.